Judith Butler is a leading academic in gender studies and is also Jewish. But this comment at a recent talk has got a lot of people fuming on social media.
We can have different views about Hamas as a political party. We can have different views about armed resistance. But I think it is more honest and historically correct to say that the uprising of October 7th was an act of armed resistance. It is not a terrorist attack, and it's not an anti-Semitic attack. It was an attack against Israelis, and, I did not like that attack. I have gone public with this. I have gotten in trouble for saying it was, for me, anguishing. It was anguishing. It was terrible. However, I would be very foolish if I then decided that the only violence in the scene was the violence done to Israeli people. The violence done to Palestinians has been happening for decades. This was an uprising that comes from a state of subjugation and against a violent state apparatus. Okay, let us be clear. Now, you can be for or against armed resistance, you can be for or against Hamas, but let us at least call it armed resistance, and then we can have a debate about whether we think it's right or whether they did the right thing, whether a different strategy. But the problem is if you call it armed resistance, you are immediately thought to be in favor of armed resistance and in favor of that armed resistance and that tactic. It's like, well, actually, maybe not that tactic. And we can discuss armed resistance. It is an open debate.
Now, that comment seemed just perfectly reasonable to me, right? Hamas is a movement which resists foreign occupation. That doesn't mean they're good people, right? It doesn't mean they haven't committed war crimes or atrocities. It doesn't mean you should support them, right? It just means that they are a part of a war against an occupying power, which, at least in Gaza and the West Bank, everyone recognizes Israel is. Right? They are a resistance movement against an occupying power. Doesn't mean you have to agree with what they've done. Doesn't even mean you have to agree with their aims, right? But that's what they are. Those words from Judith Butler, though, got a lot of people very annoyed. And it's mainly via hate shares that the clip has got over 6 million views now. So many people sharing this saying, Judith Butler, what an idiot, that 6 million people have seen it. Now, Chris Rufo is one of them. He's a very influential American right-winger. He tweeted this: queer theorist Judith Butler rages against heteropatriarchy and phallogocentrism, then runs cover for a group of men who rape, mutilate, and murder innocent women. This is the ideology that is driving American universities and must be sent back to the margins. And now Christopher Rufo is someone who worked with Ron DeSantis against critical race theory. So he was sort of the big originator, really, of that campaign in the United States. Kate Maltby is very different from Christopher Rufo. She's a centrist columnist at the iPaper in the UK. She says, in the very week the UN acknowledged the Hamas gang rapes, Judith Butler knows full well that the rape of women by men cannot constitute resistance from a state of subjugation. It is the oldest expression there is of power by a globally dominant class over a subjugated class. Ben Shapiro's response was more pithy, again, a very famous right-wing journalist and commentator. He says, Judith Butler, trash then, trash now, trash always. Helena, this row seems completely stupid to me. Right? It seems everyone say, oh, Judith Butler, she supports Hamas, she supports everything that happened on October the 7th. She's just saying, or they're just saying, sorry, non-binary, they're just saying, this isn't just some irrational hatred. This is not just brown baddies hate Jews, and that we just end the analysis there, right? The context is that there is an anti-colonial resistance movement in Gaza and in the West Bank, and yes, resistant movements can do terrible things. There might be resistance movements you don't even really support, like the Mujahideen. Right, in Afghanistan, they were a resistance movement against Soviet occupation. You might prefer Soviet occupation to the Mujahideen, I don't know. But they're a resistance movement. What do you think of this row?
So I think I have some sympathy with people who take umbrage with the comments that they made in that particular statement there. But I think that we go into really muddy waters, because you're absolutely right. It is within international law 100% justified for any occupied people to engage in military action against their occupiers. And we should remember that on October the 7th, a third of casualties on the Israeli side were security forces, at least some of whom, maybe they were on military bases, some were administering an occupation, but the majority, the absolute majority of people who died on October the 7th were civilians, and they were deliberately targeted civilians as well. Journalists have seen the footage from the GoPros from October the 7th, and we know that if you were looking at these kind of things, and given that when there was a person who was knowledgeable, who was friends with Yahya Sinwar, who was interviewed on Sky News about this, understanding that the method and the reason behind the attacks was to try and force some kind of change in terms of policy with regards to how the global community talks about the occupation. And if you're attacking military occupiers, absolutely justified. But I can understand why people would look at attacks on civilians and regard them as terrorism. And it's really difficult to be able to use other ways of describing it, even though, of course, there is a full range of the resistance forces, not just Hamas, but other groups as well, who have been continually engaging in armed resistance, as well as engaging in what people would describe as terror attacks ever since the occupation started for the last 50 years or so. The issue that I have personally, the biggest issue that I have with this entire discourse is, well, okay, if you want to describe terrorism as politically motivated violence or violence to achieve a political outcome, then there is a lack of level to which we assign and apportion the label of terrorism to each side of this conflict. Israel blatantly engaging in unreasonable military actions, genocide, ethnic cleansing, improportionality, even under what Western democracies currently are describing it as, for political and explicitly political ends, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, and have been for the entirety of the length of the occupation. Yet do people describe Israel as a terrorist state? No, they do not. They never do. We do on the left, because we clearly understand that there is some level of a dichotomy going on here between the actions of both unscrupulous members of the resistance brigades and the IDF. And there were legitimate acts of resistance that have been carried out. I think a lot of us looked at the scenes on October the 7th, saw the wall broken down as symbolic of Palestinian resistance. Outside of what may have happened, so what has happened rather, the ones that did happen, say for example, the Supernova Festival, completely unjustifiable. I would personally characterize that as a terrorist attack. Yet at no point does anybody who condemns the actions of the resistance brigades, do they ever condemn the occupation itself, or indeed the violence that Israel engage in continually, constantly throughout the occupation. That's a label that never gets levied at the state of Israel, and should do, and should be condemned as such.
We already have a word for, one force in a battle who commits an atrocity. It's a war crime, right? So when we might want to, when we talk about sort of Israel bombing civilians, we might want to call that terrorism. You can do, but the normal vocabulary is to say they're however you prefer to say it, you could say an occupying force, they're a belligerent. But when they target civilians, as it seems that they have done, we call it a war crime. So it seems odd to me that when you're talking about Hamas, it's terrorism, and when you're talking about Israel, it's a war crime. I appreciate what you're saying. You're quite rightly sort of demanding consistency. Either you call what Israel are doing terrorism, and you call Hamas. You need to apply the same language to both groups. I mean, that doesn't mean that you apply moral equivalency to both groups, because you might say that the self-determination of the Palestinian people is more important than Israel trying to create a greater Israel. Or you might say that, Hamas's ends are not yours, and so you're not particularly interested in their battle for self-determination. As I said, the Mujahideen were a movement for the self-determination of Afghanistan. It's ambiguous whether them winning was a good thing. I don't really know. Don't have strong opinions on it. Maybe I should learn a bit more about it. Why do you think this has caused so much upset online? I think for me, in a way, it seems like it's because it risks, humanizing Palestinians and saying that, they're not mad, right? And because I'd say the same thing about Israel. I don't think Israel are fighting this war just because they have this strange pathological hatred of Palestinians. I think they want the land, right? I think there's some rational logic here. And I think the same pretty much applies for Hamas. I don't think they're driven by sort of bloodlust and hate. I think they want self-determination in Palestine. And they might do some horrific things along the way.
100%, I agree with you on that. There's an explicit desire to try and paint all of the Palestinian resistance as just entirely being staffed or being consisting of people who don't have any political ideological ends, are not engaging in any justifiable acts, and are just mad people who hate the West, who engage in violence for no reason whatsoever. And of course, we all understand here that there is a legitimate act of resistance going on here, and that wants to be played down. This is why you see, when you saw Isaac Herzog being interviewed by Laura Kuenssberg all of those months ago, talking about how, well, actually, Hamas are like ISIS. They're like, they even call them Hamas, ISIS, Hitler in the most kind of bizarre level of equivalency I've ever seen. But there's a desire to try and not have a reasonable discussion and debate about how we got here, what is wrong and what is right about the entirety of the Israel-Palestine conflict, how all of the historical materials and analysis you can have of the last 50 years of occupation, the last 75 years of conflict. We want to forget all of this. We want to forget all of those reasons as to why this happened, instead to paint October the 7th as some random act of violence with no preceding level to which there was any provocation towards it at all. And that's why this narrative has been going on for so long. Hamas ISIS was a clear part of Hezbollah narrative to try and paint them as just being like the crazy ISIS people, rather than as a legitimate force of people who are under occupation, who want to resist it through military means. And that's the reason we've seen that narrative continue for so long, in my mind.